Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have two terrific poets with us today, Lois P. Jones and Fiona Bennett. Lois will read first, and then Fiona. Lois P. Jones' first poetry collection, Night Ladder, was published by Glass Lyre Press and was a finalist for the Julie Suk Award. She is the 2023 winner of the Alpine Fellowship in Poetry, which took place in Sweden. Awards include the Bristol Poetry Prize, the Tiferet Poetry Prize, and others. Jones's work has been published or is forthcoming in the Academy of American Poets, Poetry, Wales, Plume, Image, Guernica Editions, Agenda, and elsewhere. Since 2007, she has hosted KPFK's Poets Cafe and acts as poetry editor for the Pushcart and Utney Prize-winning Kyoto Journal. Here's a wonderful, jubilant poet, Lois P. Jones.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you so much. I was just thinking today how much I appreciate the space that you've created for poetry and exchanges about poetry and different subjects that, span translation, acting, just such a thoughtful and contemplative hour. And I'm grateful to be here for that. I thank you for your spirit. I'm also deeply overjoyed to be with my friend, Fiona Bennett. I just want to say, because I wrote a little something because it is important to me. Don't worry, Fiona, to get this right. I just wanted to say that Rilke said that there's no such thing as chance. And in the matter of friends, it couldn't be truer of my friendship with Fiona. From the first poems we connected to online at the poetry school, when only words were visible, to our meeting over Zoom during COVID, sharing books with friends, to our encounters in the UK and the US, we continue to bloom into possibility. And I'm really honored to be with you today. So I'm going to start with a poem from my book, because I may be going into some slightly darker subjects. And so, I'll start with something on the lighter side. And this is actually for a friend of mine who I co-hosted the Moon Day Poetry Series with for many years, Alice Perrow. And I saw an amazing photograph of her. She was standing near the wash, which is behind where she lived in Sunland. And she had this red dress on. And so here came the poem called Big Tahunga. The wind is humming in your red dress. The wind is humming in your red dress. And the moon and stars do their slow tambourine dance to praise this universe, so Rumi says. There's a glory in the way you stand, as if the body wants to move in quick arpeggio, bouncing on a soul spring, letting the ground raise you, breeze lifting your skirt as you walk the wash, and let your mind tango with creosote and mesquite. This is where the Tongva slept, in huts made of willow and tule reed, right here at the edge of the creek, where families feasted on acorns, cooked quail and rabbit, on soft ground near your roots. Anything could happen to you now. Ghost moths fluttering in the shadows, ravens startling the jackrabbits in the deerweed and sumac. Some spirit rushing past you like tumbleweed. The sun is staking its claim, turning your skin to gold leaf. Time makes you thirsty, hungry for what really feeds you. You're hoping the bees will show, will hum you with their clear wings, will honey you and take you home. From Night Ladder. So my next poem is turning towards a subject that's been on many of our minds and has to do with war and how can we articulate anything about it. Somehow I keep going back to different wars and trying to process everything of this continuum of war. But I came across this great line by Joanna Klink, which is also the title of this poem. And it says, I'm unable to picture anything so whole. It doesn't crush what's missing. A name begins with flight, a lightness like Mona Lisa smiling through museum glass until it's trapped inside another's making, until it's heavy as a bomb, a sound which clamors inside a mouth. You can't leave its chill, the frenzy of pigeons feasting on the few words granted a life, the mind battered as shuttlecock. Sometimes if I animate the tongue, a word is soldered into stained glass, and I can step across the ledger stones to you, look through your glass lid to an underworld of footholds when you were a hint of meteor. But the soul's fontanelle hardens from too many endings, from borders piled with bodies, and grief is swallowed in the angry shouts of a crow. When the bells cry in the dove tower, the gods don't care how these glass-blown beads at the artisan shop resemble your eyes. Soldiers reinvent the air in the village square with their rookery of feathers, where children once played under sweet thorns. But what's real is edged in the hem of your shroud, is shriek in the empty trees I turn toward. So I've been working on a manuscript for several years. I did read a couple of poems, I think, Harry, last time I was here, from a manuscript, which is based on the memoir from Frida Baumgartner, who lived with Rilke at Museau for the last 6 years of his life. And I've been writing persona poems from her perspective and different perspectives of characters and so on. And one of the things that really intrigued me, and is kind of becoming a theme within the book, is this idea of what remains after we die. Is there a continuum? And I really was intrigued by the fact that when I read her memoir, she said that, I'll read you the epigraph. So this is called The Ghost of Oneself. And the epigraph says, once we arrived at Museau's gate, everything looked so familiar to me, like a déjà vu. Suddenly I remembered, with exactly the same image, a gate, old birch trees, a courtyard with a bubbling fountain. Because I have no life, it's easier to remember who I was, though exact names pass from flesh into sunlight, forgotten. What stays belongs to a land's measure, a root system of the soul, a kind of capillary consciousness for the places I thirsted, drank, became. And so, too, a transpiration, something of me exhaled into the air, revisited, rebreathed. These things fall across the senses like a fingerprint no winter can erode. It's the only way to explain how the birches swayed with returning. A sky and soft and familiar as my blue shift. Why? I'm at the foot of the poet's vineyard now, everything flushed with October. I want to empty my mind into this brook as it moves from the ancient glacier so I can see what flows from past into present. I want to want again, to be the poplar's quivering gold, to kneel and feel my bare knees in the late summer burn. A cloud haunts me from its tufted height. It has a woman's eyes. I close mine and remember old birch trees, acacias, a courtyard with a bubbling fountain. This land holds me in its hands like a pocket watch. So one day, Frida came downstairs in the middle of the night and had a bit of a surprise. This is based on a quote that I found from the Poetics of Space by Bachelard. The poem's title is called Frida's Glove, Chateau Museo, summer 1922. But the quote is, the poet Rilke enjoyed donning his maid suede gloves and dusting furniture in the wee hours of the morning, like caressing the body of a lover. Quote, after this, he said, there's nothing that you do not know. There was a candle burning inside my brow. I could not pinch its flames, so I crept out of the fevered bed to the forest of our floors and their cool green against my feet. Then a shadow near the window, just a hand at first moving up the velvet drapes, independent as a whistle from nowhere. A thin figure of a man emerged slightly from this stage, fingers and thumb gliding up the drape's edge. There was something at his wrist, a thickness between the fingers like a new skin, a fourchette with a slight webbing, which layered the delicate hand. My suede glove touched the tie back, then moved slowly up the plaited cord, then down. One finger drew the line of its own profile from forehead to neck, and I felt as if he traced my own throat, down to the clavicle, then up again to the edge of my left lobe. I shivered. The moon shook too, so sewn to the poet's mind that the fabric of our scene tilted, then buried itself in the night's scene. So epistolary is a letter, something we don't write very often by hand to others. But of course, in those days, that was one of the only forms of communication. And this is called epistolary to Frida's sister Rose. Dear Rose, from his balcony, the night sky is a portal to a pinhole of other lives, some barely visible. As if what is remembered grows into the far away. Sometimes I think death is a sky so black you leave all your life behind. But I don't want to forget the touch of sun burning the backs of my hands as I cradle petals grown loose from their bodies and inhale a rose that is more than this red becoming. I don't want to lose that perfect shadow of being and not being in the world. This is the way life is. You are always here on hard soil, and what you want is north or south of you. I've lost myself in this snow globe of disappearance. I shake the universe again and again, and the stars just keep falling. They don't know any other way. So, going back to that idea of there's no such thing as chance. Last year, I was able to go to Sweden because a poem won the Alpine Fellowship. And today, I actually announced the winner of this year's Alpine Fellowship. So it feels like a beautiful time to share this poem again. And it was based on a line from Rilke's Duino Elegies, the ninth, where he says, one for each thing, just once, no more. And we too, just once. So this is my response. I found a city of narrow passageways where the day filtered in, dove gray, sheltered and soft. Sometimes an entire life is spent in museum light, and you become a part of its diffusion. I might be anyone, a stranger caught beneath the repeating arc of portico, each curve rising in my rib. I might have been the bas-relief I passed under, the saint I was, the ruin I became. Once I awoke in Venetian twilight and crept barefoot down the stone steps to the water to watch my face tremble with the moon. This was before they mistook me for a whore, then moored me to a life of silk and pearls and the salty breath of counts and countesses. But I was no courtisane de lume, but a woman worthy of sin. And they said, Angel, are you drowning your bed sheets in the moon's pool water? And I said, I spend my time like a coin on its back, shining for no one. Satisfied as a hinge pin swung open, a handbell that's found its clapper. One life could never be enough. We long for what we can't explain, like the four-poster bed in an antique shop I wept over for days. This feeling of a small child who walked toward me through the grass but never reached my hand. Rilke asks, but to the other realm, what can be taken? And I say everything follows us from room to room. Our lives hungry for what we feed them in the dark. Worlds begin like this. My second to last poem is about an amazing experience I had during COVID when I went on my own to Big Sur, and had a little cabin. And every day or every night, I'd hear the river going by. And I was happy to find out that actually, well, there was a tribe that used to inhabit that space, the Esquivel, and they can be traced back as far as 6,500 years. And of course, they were driven out by the missionaries and they took the land, but more recently, they've been given a chunk of it back. But at one point, when I was near the river and I was taking photographs, I caught an image of what looked like a young girl standing by the river. And she had this cloak on. And little did I know that when I looked up the history, I found almost the exact archival image of a type of dress that the young Esalen women wore. So this is after Joanna Klink's Sea by Dusk, and it's called Big Sur Redwoods by Full Moon, Shifting Voices, October 2020. Comes to you from Titans and says, be shadow, be silence. Gathers the length of longing and says, crown the sky with impermanence. Comes in the middle of caution, and October felled into acres of loss. Drinks the light, lulling the waves of disaster that brought you here. Enters the path at midnight when the deer's eyes empty into trembling, says, you who know strength, keep standing. No fires will catch the heartwood where you live. No oceans will drown you in their history. Dream, the path calling you beyond evening's bleed of wood smoke into the clearing. Be somnambulant. Walk in the certainty there is no blindness, only what comes between you and this act of knowing. All, like a nocturne into the river, rushing like grain beneath your pillow, shifting the rhythm of your breath beyond the newly dead. Tonight is a long hour without minutes, this blue bead of moonlight on your brow. Be a spirit girl who stands in clear water, stilling everything, trees, stones, root skin, invisible creatures who pause as you think of them. Shelter in the mirror of her image, her cape of gray doves, dense as the moss that surrounds her. Be stunned as the shaft of life light on her face. Move like a hymn in the hidden worlds. Be here, only here. And I'm going to end with a poem from Rilke. It was one of his late poems. He wrote 400 French poems. And this one was written in 30 August 1920, just before Frida, his housekeeper, arrived. Oh, what survives? Who says that all must vanish? Who knows? Perhaps the flight of the birds you wound remains, and perhaps flowers survive our caresses in their ground. It isn't the gesture that lasts, but it dresses you again in gold armor from breast to knees. And the battle was so pure, an angel wears it after you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois. Your poetry is tender and loving and compassionate and clear-eyed, and you're just so much erudition and eloquence. I always love the way you take an image and then you have the human, and it could be a real physical detail or a literary image, and then connect it all in such a very seamless way with the larger world too. And the way you take us through that, could you just talk to us a couple minutes or about how you make a poem? Take a poem like take the poem about the woman who lived with Rilke for the last 6 years of his life. I mean, I love Rilke too. We did a reading of the Duino Elegies, which may be the greatest poem of the 20th century. But could you just talk us about what your foundation for that is, and then how you move through the poem, how you make it?
Wow. Yeah. So, I have huge thanks to Eva West, who was the translator for the original German memoir, which came across my path. That's a longer story, but she has been just absolutely instrumental in making the poem possible at all, because she's put the words into English on the page for me. And so starting from the foundation, one of the things I mentioned was this deja vu aspect, which really intrigued me about Frida. She got to Muso. She said, I feel like this is familiar to me. I've been here. So that created a kind of energy. That was the buzz of, wow, because I myself am so intrigued by that subject. And then here I am coming into this memoir because I have a deep passion for Rilke. And just to also put in the backdrop of this, I also went to his grave. I went to Muso. I laid out on the land behind his house. I mean, I've gotten that energy as much as possible. So it's all been this process of between the experiential and the memoir. And so starting from that point of the vibration of energy of her deja vu was really a part of the starting point for this series.
You really get into the whole, that's essential. It's just incredible. You really do breathe life into it, and then you also take your poetry into another realm. It's like it exists up there. They always say, one person once said that poetry should aspire to music. It gets in that realm where, it's just somewhat abstract, but it's real in an imaginary way. So thank you for that. And another question I'd like to ask you, could you tell us a little bit about the Poets Cafe at KPFK? I did one, my late wife and I, Holly, did one years ago with Aram Saroyan was the interviewer on that one. But could you just tell us about your involvement with the Poets Cafe and some of the people that have been on there? How long you've been doing that? I think you said since 2007. Right.
And now it's being done by other hosts because the show comes on every week and I can't possibly do a show a week. I have a full-time job on top of all the other poetry biz. So I just do shows when I can. But this is also, I'll just say, one of the elemental connecting points between myself and Fiona, because not only did we have a shared affinity for poetry and the aesthetic behind those poems and words and spirit, but she also has founded and co-hosted the Poetry Exchange. So we had some really interesting conversations around what it meant to sit down with the poet in front of you and have that interaction and what we love about it. So I have had locals, national, international actors, scientists. I've had such a myriad blend of people on there, which I think is what makes poetry interesting. When we have these intersecting worlds of the sciences, of dance, of other fields. I've had a policewoman poet on there. She had such a great wicked book. I loved interviewing her. So, every single poet who comes on, it's such a joy to go deep into the conversation with them and their book. And it's like a session. It feels like we start somewhere and we go through this arc of exchange. And at the end, we're like, wow, what happened? I don't know how to explain it, but I think Fiona knows what I'm talking about. It's this course, you just don't know where it's going to go. It's almost like the poem revealed itself, right? Because you start from the starting point and then it ends in a surprise. And it's not all, you may have certain questions you want to ask somebody, but it's also very organic and you have to be able to be spontaneous and respond to what the person is saying in the moment. So, I had Neil deGrasse Tyson on there and he was talking about his book and he loves haiku. And he had just had a book out that year with a poem, a couple of poems in it. And, he'll say, I'm not a poet, but, we got to talk about poetry and conversations around that. So it's exciting for me as it is in writing a poem, when you get that, oh, wow, we're going to talk about this, and I can see how that's going to grow into something really interesting for the audience. You hope anyway. So, yeah. Well, thank you very much, Lois, for such a fabulous reading and also for your great contribution to the poetry community and beyond. Thank you. I appreciate everything that you do in terms of poetry. So thank you, Lois. Our next poet is Fiona Bennett. Fiona Bennett is a poet, curator, and founder of the award-winning project and podcast, The Poetry Exchange, and co-author
of its forthcoming anthology, Poems as Friends. Her poems have been published in journals including the Rialto and the San Pedro River Review, and listed in competition including the 2022 National Poetry Competition and 2023 the Bridport Prize. She has an MA in poetry from the Poetry School, Newcastle University. As a curator, her collaborations include work with the National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company. She recently curated and directed the poetry score for Then or Now, a new ballet choreographed by William Tuckett featuring the poetry of Adrian Rich. Here's a marvelous and generous poet, Fiona Bennett.
Oh, thank you so much, Harry and Lois. A wonderful evening. This is, I should say lunchtime for you there. It's evening here now. I was thinking as the moon was shaking in Lois's poem, so it was appearing here. So it's just wonderful to be here. It's a tremendous honor to be invited to read, and a real pleasure to read alongside Lois, whose work is a complete inspiration to me, even in the in linear terms, relatively short time in which we've known each other, as far as we understand the clock to be counting, not that we're counting. Just beautiful reading this evening as well. I'm such sensuous poems, and always such a pleasure to hear them in your voice. So thank you so much. I'm going to read some poems of my own, and then I'm going to finish by talking a little bit about the Poetry Exchange, which Harry's mentioned, and the forthcoming anthology, and reading a little extract from that. But I'll start with some of my own poems. And I'm going to begin by reading a poem that features trees. Trees are something Lois and I share a love of, and have enjoyed in the few times that we've met together, once in the UK and twice in the UK, I should say, and once when I had the great pleasure to come over and visit her there in LA. And this is a poem that features a landscape not far from those of you that are there in that part of the world, Big Bear, that Lois and her friend and fellow poet, and now I'm delighted to say friend of mine, the brilliant Elena Karina Byrne, introduced us to, and we had a very special and powerful time there. And this is a poem that came from that time. And there's nothing that happens by chance, as Lois has told us, and I just happened to notice that jackrabbits featured in her first poem, and there's one here too. Uhaviat, Boulder Country, Big Bear. Jackrabbit is an early warning system. Pine penetrates between surfaces. Snowmelt holds its power underground. A lizard sees round corners, hears the sea in the trees. A beetle creeps along fissures in bark. Woodpecker, blue jay, and hawk share one sky. Their flight paths choreograph water and light. Stone invites passage and yields to no one. To climb is to breathe deeper, seek a new view. No horizon finishes it. Each ascent exposes a higher outcrop. Strata of rock, rust red, knows whose story was stolen, and whose spirit, unbroken, pulses now beneath your feet. Rest long enough to taste vanilla on the breeze. Remember your place here. Look up, the aspen are shimmering, whispering the names of those who came before you. And I'm going to stay with landscape for a while and read one that's closer to home. And this comes from an encounter that I had on the meadows near where I live, just down the way there, here in Chester in northwest England. This is called Taken. After the first hedgerow busy with birds, and before the charred sycamore, they met me, 5 stallions, magnificent and black, still as the evening air around them. One by one, they ceased gnawing at the grass, tensed their thick necks to lift their weighty heads, the dark pools of their eyes looking through me to the wound inside. I picked up my pace, headed on for the river, keeping watch of them from the corner of my eyes as I passed. The encounter over, I let my held breath go, but as I did, I heard their hooves heavy and soft on the track behind me, pushing me to go faster, the heat of their presence at my back, the musty scent of them swirling around my head. I made it to the bench, but as I sat, they halted, encircling the spot, each choosing his own direction. The tallest came to stand between me and the river, his sleek flanks looming above my face as they gathered, defending my weakness, taking me in to their fold. I suppose that's one of those moments that you can have in an encounter with nature, with creatures, where there's that blend of fear and safety going on. And I think sometimes writing is like that too. American women poets, past and present, have always felt like kindred spirits to me, and I've had much companionship in the company of their poems, and their voices have played a huge part in liberating my own. So the reasons for reading this next one will be obvious, and this poem is forthcoming in the next issue of Under the Radar, the magazine that's part of the brilliant UK-based press, Nine Arches Press. Emily Dickinson's corset and her white gown. Vessel of cloth and bone turned in on itself, mouth wide open, cradle to carry her birth cry, to rock her dreams, ribbed wing narrowed, focused to a point, breath as microscope, lotus hands to catch butterfly, beetle, snail, small dead things, worn in the day, laid down at night, when the white dress let loose the strings and unbound, spectre-free, murmuring, she empties her specimens, ink to the page. Feels somewhat audacious to read a poem inspired by Emily Dickinson in this moment, but I hope I'll be allowed to do that. Over the last year or so, I've been noticing how hands and gestures tend to appear in my poems. I used to hear poets I admired a lot talk about how they noticed a certain motif recurring in their work, and I used to think, I don't have any motifs, nothing is recurring, and that everything was very eclectic. But then I did notice this business of the hands, and with the background that I have in theatre, I worked in theatre for over 15 years in various roles, and I still collaborate closely with many performers and performance companies, and I take huge inspiration from that field of work and those artists. And I suppose there's also a constant curiosity, and I've always had that, I think poets have this as much as actors, but that sort of obsessive observation of human interaction wherever you may be. So I've been exploring gesture in theme and form in my poems. Sometimes it's a poem about a gesture, and it's also that idea of the poem itself as gesture, which resonates for me in what happens for me when I read poetry. And you have that sense of the nature of the gesture that is coming from the poem itself. So this is called Imprint. A hand on the shoulder, a knee in the back, a cheek shoved on the pavement, a neck strained back, a ring on a finger, a band of gold, an arm wrenched from its socket, a kiss gone cold, a fist raised in power, a fist clenched in fear, a fist in the playground, a fist in the ear. Fingertips tapping, fingers waiting to be heard, fingers feeling for a switch, fingers feeling for a word, palms cupped for water, palms meeting in prayer, palms raised to lift the air, a hand lifted in a classroom, a hand on the edge of a boat, a hand tethered to a railing, a hand raised to vote, a statue in iron, a statue in stone, an arm raised in victory, an arm severed to bone, an arm laid beside a body, a head dropped low, a hand held forever, a hand let go. This next poem I wrote some years ago following a report on the war in Syria, and in particular an account of the courageous work of a group of people in Dorea, which was under siege from government forces and being bombed daily, and that even in this extreme situation that they were in, without medical provision or food, they rescued books from the bombed houses and created a secret library underground. And you can read about this story, which was brilliantly reported on at the time by the UK journalist Mike Thompson. And the story has been brilliantly documented in his book, The Secret Library of Syria. And of course, there are many resonances now for the suffering and courage that's being shown by people in other situations of tremendous violence and oppression and failure of humankind. The poem has an epigraph from Wordsworth's The Prelude, and the epigraph reads, "But as a pilgrim resolute, I took, even with the chance equipment of that hour, the road that pointed to the chosen vale." The Secret Library, Dorea, Syria, 2016. From his post on the edge of what's left of his city, among rubble, hoops of barbed wire and burnt out cars, he watches through his father's old binoculars for black marks on a dirt grey sky. All clear, he puts his rifle down, takes up the small solid block of a leather-bound book. One ear remains on duty as foreign syllables swim up from the page, then cluster into shapes his mouth closes round like cherries. Home, pomp, stone. Then the strange musical ones he loves most, Empyrean, dedication, magnificent. The old idea comes back to him, nudges at the edge of who he once was. Pilgrimage, the right to travel out in search of something holy and to return to the sanctity of home. So sometimes poems with hands and gestures and movement and embodiment come from the world of theatre itself and from experiences of being in auditoriums. And this is called The Rehearsal. I crept in at the back of the auditorium. The stage manager called the action to a pause. The players' limbs dropped slack. You rose towards them from the stalls, moved among them like a current through water, feeling for emptiness and contour. I saw the knowledge of what was missing shudder through your body like a tremor. And when you gave your note, it was offered so softly they had to lean in to hear you. The scene began again. Handwritten letters dropped from the gantry like snowflakes. A flock of hands soared up to catch them, silhouetted wings caught in yellow light. I clasped my hand over my mouth to stop love's first gasp, finding me out. And this next poem I'll read is one that Lois has been close to, and it's in the current edition of the beautiful Kyoto Journal. It's inspired by Michael Onjate's novel Anil's Ghost, and a passage there that details the work of those who carve and paint the great statues of Buddha. And as the epigraph explains, an epigraph to the poem from the novel, no human eye can meet the Buddha's. So when the Buddha's eyes need to be painted, the work is done by two people, and there's an assistant that will hold the mirror for the person with the paintbrush. And so I just explain that to give the architecture of what's happening here, in which I imagine myself as the assistant. Holding the mirror. Imagine the stone-carved Buddha, still and alone in the woods. From a distance, we are insects at the foot of its infinite ladder. I am papoose to your side as we begin the climb, scale the folds of his robe, the curve of his belly. The air thins as we reach the trunk of his neck. We do not look up into the moon of his face. Below, paddy fields patchwork the valley, stitch the earth with their watery harvest. I hold the mirror up, its line of sight angled over your shoulder, reflecting the great blank oval, his empty eye awaiting your colour. I pass the brush, nestle into your neck, until the unspoken truth of you, the bottle green hue of your darkness, wets the stone, his sight alive in the line of your stroke. And just as I sort of head towards finishing, as I said, I just wanted to share something about the Poetry Exchange. As Lois said, we met through the writing of poetry and also through hosting conversations about poetry. And for around 10 years now, I've been, along with colleagues, fellow poets and act as inviting people, in particular readers of poetry, so sometimes poets, but sometimes people from other walks of life, to come and talk to us about a poem that's been a friend to them. I think that's very much been part of my relationship with reading poetry, that it holds for me that kind of conversation that you might hope to have with a close friend in the small hours, perhaps around the kitchen table, when you really get to where things are at. Poems have held that kind of conversation. So it's been an immense privilege, and I know some people who've been part of this gathering are with us in the reading now, so that's really special too. And we hosted these conversations and found that the insights, of course, were phenomenal. And then we created the podcast. And then over the last couple of years, my fellow collaborator, Michael Schaefer, and I have been creating an anthology, bringing the stories of the readers and the poem that's intervened in their life together in a book. And the book arrived in my house 4 days ago. So I hope you don't mind if I just take this moment to sort of hold it up there. Can't quite get that right in the way that I'm back to front to myself, but there we are. And yeah, it's been a joy putting it together, and it's coming out, publication in the UK May the 9th and in the States in September. And yeah, you'll find stories in there from people from all walks of life, as I said. Some names you might know. Actor Andrew Scott talking about the poem Love by George Herbert. And also, of course, I'm delighted that it also features Lois's beautiful thoughts about Rilke, and indeed that poem What Survives that she read so beautifully at the end of her reading. So I'm going to read one back for Lois. And this is a poem that features in the book by Carrie Williams Clifford. And this poem is called Friendship. Most of the poems in the book don't directly address friendship. They've acted as friends to people, but this one does. Friendship by Carrie Williams Clifford. Not by the dusty stretch of days, slow gathering to lengthening years, we measure friendship's chain, but by the understanding touch, the smile, the soul kiss, yea, the tears that ease the load of pain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fiona. I love the richness and the particulars in your poetry and the superlative use of language. And you just have such great narrative strength. And there's also, you go so deep and the humanity within it. And there's an exaltation in your poetry. And I love that last book that you showed up, the anthology, Poems as Friends. What a great title. I'd like to just ask you a few questions. When did you write your first poem?
Oh, Harry, thank you for those very generous and lovely words. That's a great question. I think I wrote some really dodgy ones, as I'm sure many of us did in my teenage years. I actually had forgotten that I had, but I did then find some, as one does when one's doing a clear out. And I sort of gave myself a bit of a fright looking at some of those. But actually, I mean, I did find poetry through theatre. I did theatre at school and at university, and a lot of Shakespeare. And so I was kind of steeped in Shakespeare. And, you know, when that's the bar, I think it's quite hard to get anywhere near it. So then I diverted, and I wasn't writing poetry at all, but I was steeped in theatre and a lot of Shakespeare. And then I eventually realised that I was into the Shakespeare for the poetry, and found myself in the privacy of my own bedroom writing poems, I guess not so long ago, when I started to take it seriously around 2010. And strangely enough, that sort of journey, when I started to take it seriously, that also took me to the States, and I had the great privilege of studying with Marge Piercy, and that was a kind of an immersion for me then. So that was around 2010. But I mean, I'd written poems before then, but I don't even know if I want to think about them.
Well, what is it about the poetry form that attracts you to it? I think it is something that you've already mentioned, and that is very present in Lois's work. I think it is that sense of song somewhere, and the music that you were talking about that is there, and getting into that realm, and I suppose all poetry, has that sort of ironic space of stepping in while language fails, but in the form of language. And there's something about that that I enjoy, and I think that's where this thing of gesture, because gestures are the same thing. I'm doing it now, sort of trying to say what I'm failing to say, kind of here. So there's something about that space within and beyond language that is fascinating to me. You mentioned the theater. Were you an actor?
No, I was more in the direction, I would say. And what the title I often held was education director. So I often was involved in creating workshops and curating interventions that involved actors. So a lot of collaboration, close collaboration with actors, and a lot of close collaboration with other directors, and a lot of time spent in rehearsal rooms. And more recently, a great privilege to also be in dance studios and to have collaborations with choreographers and dancers, where, again, there's this fascinating meeting point, I think, between art forms, which I enjoy very much.
And how has, poetry and theater, in some ways, they're disparate, because poetry, it's you, you're not performing or you're not directing a play. What are the connections or the non-connections that you see between poetry and the theater?
I think a really great play, the experience of a really great play, and how all of it, the elements, kind of happen, is a poem to me. In some way it is. And they have their boundaries that are very different, I suppose. The time and space is happening in different ways, but they have a deep connection for me somewhere. But as you say, you don't have the same. Of course, there is performance poetry, and the performing of poetry is a fantastic thing. But I think it's something to do with, that sense of being alive and asking all the questions that I think theatre is great at, and great poetry does too.
Well, we've come to the end of our program, and Lois, why don't you come on and let me just say to both of you, I just want to say to you, Lois, and to you, Fiona, thank you very much for the richness of your poetry and the humanity that's involved in there. And the music, as you pointed out, is inherent in good poetry, and both of your poetry. And the other thing I want to just say is thank you so much for your sense of communitas, the sharing and the helping and giving to others, and in particular, the poetry world. I appreciate that very much. So it's been an exhilarating poetry reading for me. Both of you women are just incredible, uplifting poets. So thank you very much. And I'm going to make us tell you about next Tuesday's poetry reading. Next Tuesday, Lori Bedekian and William Archilla, two terrific poets, will be with us, and I hope you join us. So thanks again once more, Lois P. Jones and Fiona Bennett. Fiona's in the UK, and it's been a wonderful reading. So thank you. And here's Allegra Leedom to take it over for the next program that's coming up. Thank you all.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harry. It was wonderful.